Member, Councillor Headley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will try and keep this as brief as possible because I know this is only the hors d'oeuvre to the main course tonight. And this is a really positive, good news story. Can I take the opportunity, I know sometimes it's considered invidious to actually name officers of this council, but when I was asked to take on a cabinet role for housing, I think some people that know me know it as with a degree of hesitation that I accepted. It's always a privilege to serve on this council and to serve the little fellow at the end of the table. But what I do find is that housing has been a complete revelation. I couldn't have had greater support from the officers of this borough. And can I publicly have it on record that Mandy Skeeton, James Henderson, Leslie O'Shea, Richard Larkman, I'm going to leave some out, I'm going to forget the others, but, and particularly the advice and help I've had from people like Scott Logan has been absolutely invaluable, together with the support of the Chief Executive. The officers of this council are very passionate about the jobs they do. And I think some new councillors often forget that we are only a virus of this organisation for which there's no known cure at the moment. And it really is incumbent on councillors to treat our officers with the respect that they're due because of the work that they put in for the residents of this borough on a 24-hour basis. And I think this is sometimes forgotten by councillors. Getting back to the HRA, I never saw George Osborne, who I sometimes refer to as George Cameron, because I can't tell the difference. I never really saw him as a fairy godmother until recently. But there is some legislation currently going through Parliament, and for the residents of the borough, whether they be council tenants or taxpayers, the recent changes that are highlighted in the recommendations on page 2 do show a really good deal for the taxpayer and those currently on subsidised rents in council houses. You will note that one of the changes is a 1% reduction in rent for the next 4 years, which is really equivalent to a 4% reduction because we were considering in our future financial plans for a retail price index increase, which I'm sure my colleague to the right, Stuart Sullivan, would have been dealing with. So who's the main beneficiary of this? Well, the Treasury, because approaching 70% of our tenants are on some form of benefits, and those benefits now won't be paid, the money will stay with the Treasury. So the taxpayer in the country will benefit to the tune of many millions. And it is the Conservative councillors' rebalancing of the economy that was shattered by the previous administration under Labour. Well, no, I know. It's a cheap political point.
Members, Councillor Headley has the floor, please.
It may be considered a cheap political point, but the fact is it happens to have an element of truth in it. So the recommendations that do stand there, can I just run through a couple of things? The rent policy. The 1% reduction, as I say, is good news. During the report stage in the House of Lords, it became apparent that certain types of properties may be exempt, and these are detailed in the recommendations. So recommendation 1 and 2 deals with the rent reduction, and 2 and 3 with those where there's some ambiguity as to whether the rent reduction will apply. So we can deal with that at a later stage when the legislation becomes apparent and comes into force. Of course, there will be some changes in the HRA in terms of balances and reserves, but I'm confident that the help and support this administration has had from its officers, indeed the officers work on behalf of all of the councillors and the residents of this borough, and under the guidance of our financial team, I am sure that the challenges that will be presented in the future, the risks that will be presented, will be dealt with. The officers have done a sterling job in supporting this council and making sure that the efficiencies are driven through, despite the problems that are faced financially in the UK. I resisted the temptation to say why we have those challenges. Of course, some of the other parts of the policy that will be possibly commented on are the pay to stay, as it's called, fairer rents in social housing. Now the DWP, Department of Work and Pensions, will be working with the government to identify those households which are currently receiving the subsidised rent. It's not a tax, it's a subsidised rent. And the government is minded that in social housing, where the annual household income exceeds 40,000 in London, 30,000 in the rest of the country, there will be the ability to charge those tenants a higher rent. The good news for the taxpayer is that rent goes to the Treasury, it doesn't go to the council. This feeds into the financial risk for this council. And as yet that's difficult to quantify, but as I've alluded to, we will take that in our stride. I think the other good news, and I have to commend the leader of the council. Councillor Turner is absolutely passionate about housing. He always has been. And it may have slipped some people's attention that this administration, I think we're the first administration to actually be building council housing. I think that is true. I can't remember any other administration doing it. But we will be bringing forward 3 developments to the Justice and Planning Commission on the new homes programme for the WAP. So there will be some development in Whitford, Langdon, and on the former Children's Centre at Creans, where we will be bringing forward developments in partnership with local contractors who will be employing some apprentices. So it's good news for people who want some vocational training. It keeps it within the borough. It's investment in the borough for those vulnerable people. We have currently 1,500 people on the waiting list. If we don't develop some social housing and some affordable housing in the borough, that waiting list will only get longer. There's a number of initiatives that our officers are putting forward where we're producing schemes to work with private landlords so that we can feed some of those people that are on the waiting list into private rented accommodation. It is also affordable. But I must applaud the initiative of all those officers and members that have been involved in the innovative construction of new social housing. And councillors may need to reflect. We sit here, council meeting after council meeting, where there are questions to my friend on the right concerning the local development framework. And I understand the anxiety that local development frameworks, local plans create. I chaired planning. I had the honour and the privilege to chair planning for a year, and I saw some of those planning applications come through. And I have to say, some councillors turn it into a theatre. They oppose for the sake of opposition. And I understand why people oppose the administration. That's what you do in politics. But in opposing some of those developments, opposing some of those social housing, those affordable housing, you are condemning the vulnerable and the weak in society to being condemned onto that waiting list. All of the schemes that are in the LDF will show a degree of affordable housing and social housing. And every time councillors grandstand to minority pressure groups, they are aiding and abetting people who have condemned those people to waiting on the housing list forever. We need proper development, controlled development, and we need that control to be within this council. We do not want to take the risk of losing control of our planning to some inspectorate in Bristol. And I would commend this report to you, and I hope you will support the recommendations as noted on page 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. We're now going to call Councillor Adele Brown. This is her maiden speech, so I hope everybody will
amazing speech because I hate to speak in public, but here we go. Okay, we've heard from Councillor Headley tonight talking of the benefits that our residents are going to receive from this 1% fall in rent. But he's failed to point out the financial implications of that 1% fall. So happily, the officers, which he so well praised, that I myself, again, I'm very pleased that we do have very competent, hard-working housing officers who are far more candid, particularly in their briefing which they gave to councillors. Sadly, most councillors were not at that briefing, but for the 8 of us that were, we heard from those officers the financial disaster this 1% fall is going to incur. And it's that I want to talk about this evening. Who's responsible for this financial disaster and the implications it's going to have for our HRA? Well, it's our friendly Chancellor George Osborne. In a bid to cut housing benefits, social rents are to be cut by 1% for the next 4 years from April 2016. He's called it a welcome cut in rent for those tenants who pay it. But is that really true? I'd say it is not. We know that around 70% of council tenants nationally are in receipt of housing benefits. This 1% fall will not affect their financial position at all. But rather, this revenue, as pointed out by Councillor Headley, will be heading to the Department of Works and Pensions budget, while Basildon Council will be left to cope with the additional financial burden. This is a massive reduction from the government's previous rent-setting policy from just 2013. At that time, councils were able to set rents at 1% above inflation. This policy will now result by 2019 that rents in this borough will be about 13% lower than they would have been under the previous formula. The implications of that are huge for this council and for our local housing associations within the borough. They set forward business plans and secured loans on the understanding that rents would increase, not fall. Hence, our officers have told councillors at that council briefing that this poses serious challenges to housing associations in this local authority, and that revenue streams are going to be difficult, and that the maintaining of residents' homes at present levels will prove impossible. George Osborne, at the time of the speech, also said that he was confident that housing associations and other social landlords would be able to deliver efficiency savings needed. Efficiency savings. How many times have we heard those words? But what are these efficiency savings? Here in Basildon, efficiency savings are the cancellation of capital projects, the inability to repair homes, and our inability to repay our debts. Furthermore, at a time when we are all looking to the local plan to provide much needed homes in this borough, it makes it even more difficult to ensure our stock of social housing increases. I agree with Councillor Headley that we need more housing. Sadly, this policy will not provide it. The National Housing Federation Chief Executive said that at least 27,000 less social housing homes will be built as a result of this policy, and that the right to buy of our housing associations tenants will further compound the problem. The Chartered Institute of Housing was equally unimpressed with this policy with regarding being able to build and maintain homes. Their chief exec said, "We understand the government's desire to manage the cost of housing benefits bill, but undermining their, meaning local councils, income by cutting social housing rents by 1% a year over the next 4 years is going to make it much tougher to build new homes at a time when they are so desperately needed." Due to pay and stay, which Councillor Headley talked about, many of our tenants are going to have their rents raised. So with one policy, the government is reducing rents by 1%, whilst other families are going to face a rise. The government estimates this will affect about 5% of tenants in our borough. What is going to happen to them when they cannot afford to pay? You might think it's a good thing we're going to get more revenue into our HRA, but no. This money will be directly sent to the Chancellor's Exchequer, contributing not to more services or even the reduction of deficit, but to George Osborne's desire to have a budget surplus of 14.7 billion. It is not a good deal for taxpayers. Taxpayers are our residents too. Our residents would much prefer this money stayed in our HRA and enabled us to provide decent homes for our people of Basildon. These policies are wrong for the country, they are wrong for the people of Basildon, and therefore the Labour Group will not be supporting the HRA budget.
Thank you, Councillor. Can I call Councillor Phil Turner, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can I congratulate you on your maiden speech? Very good. It wasn't along the lines I was proposing though, and I think you'd have been better served if you'd stayed maybe locally rather than drifting off into the national picture, because this policy is all about the local picture and what's affecting our residents, our tenants and Basildon Borough.
Our officers have told us that.
Councillor Turner has the floor, please.
So why is this such good news? And it is good news, not the hysteria that you just heard there, Mr. Mayor. This is good news because irrespective of whether you're under welfare or not, you're going to get a 1% reduction. Okay, so welfare people aren't going to get there. They're already protected. The 1% will come as a welcome bonus to anybody paying those rents, not just for 1 year, for 4 years. And yet it blows about a 20 million hole in our business plan. Is it disastrous? Absolutely not. Yeah, it's not good news, but it isn't disastrous. You know, we don't have the wolf at the door. We have a business plan that is sustainable over 30 years plus. And yes, we'll have to trim our sails as we're doing with all of this news. That is business as usual. And it doesn't matter whether it's a Conservative government or a Labour one. I wish the Labour members, previously, when we were under a Labour administration in Westminster, had spoken as passionately about the negative subsidy that we had to give back to the Labour administration so they could put it up north. That was 6 million a year. So after 5 years, you were talking about 30 million. And we didn't have the money to spend on our own homes. So it's slightly hypocritical. So let's get back to business. What we've actually done as an administration is we have been very prudently tailoring our service, along with officers, to deliver what we think is a good service. Allocation policy, downsizing policy. The allocation policy, incidentally, says things like you have to have a 7-year connection to have a home in Basildon. And then we've been building up our reserves in the HRA, because it is ring-fenced, to get Sempra homes off and running. Now, what you've heard about the national picture is not so good. In Basildon, it is pretty rosy. And we've identified something like sites for 500 homes. Now, identifying them and bringing them forward, that's a different matter. But this is why this administration is so passionate about delivering for Basildon residents and Basildon tenants. And the reason the passion is there, because it's not about stock, it's not about a house, it's about a home, and a home for residents. Now, everything we've done today puts us in a pretty good position. So let's forget the hysteria. Let's just get on quietly, working with our officers. And I totally agree with Councillor Headley. We have some fine officers, and I'm sure the Chief Executive will extend that commendation throughout the housing team, right down to the visitors that go around and look at these houses when we're doing repairs and services. It is the housing team that is delivering such a good service for us, so let's continue that. Let's not get distracted by all of this stuff that's going on inside. Let's just keep to the business plan, because that will deliver everything that we need. Maybe not as fast as it was before, but we are going to deliver it. Our sights are firmly set on what's right for the residents, what's right for Basildon boroughs, and top marks to Councillor Headley for bringing a superb report. Thank you.
I now call Councillor David Sherman. David Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And let's just say, I suppose in Councillor Turner's terms, here comes Hysteria Mark II. And can also commend Councillor Brown on her maiden speech. Very good. And unfortunately, I might be going over a few of the things that you mentioned in your speech. Council tenants in Basildon can expect a 1% fall in their rent bills for 2016-2017 and for the following 3 years. The reduction is in line with the government guidance and keeps council rents a lot lower than the private sector. But, and yes there is a but, as Councillor Brown mentioned, this will mean Basildon Council will generate a £20 million less income compared to what was predicted from rents over the next 4-year period. That's £20 million not being reinvested into tenants' properties and services. This is an enormous amount of money for this council to be losing. And let's be clear on this. This current minority administration has a habit of wasting money. Like £92,000 on a sign on the 127 saying Basildon. What has that done for the borough? Not a lot, apart from boost the egos of the current administration. Then we have £4,000 on a new chain for the Deputy Mayor. The last one was okay for the previous Deputy Mayor. I don't see why it's not all right for our current Deputy Mayor. And let's face it, if they're not wasting it, they're repatriating it by robbing Peter to pay Paul, as they have done with the funding of Dial and Impact. And in the process, stabbing every vulnerable person who has a disability or is disabled in the back in this borough. How does this affect our tenants, shall we say? I would say at least around 70% of our council tenants are in receipt of housing benefit. Any rent decrease would not impact them directly, but instead reflect in the DWP's budget, and at the same time, this council will have to deal with the additional financial burden. However, while a 1% rent reduction is good news for our existing tenants, it could have a significant negative impact for future tenants, as the council's future plans for building new houses are desperately impeded. We all know there is a housing crisis, and we know that we need to be building more executive and affordable homes that people within this borough desperately need, which is the best way to bring down housing benefit bill and boost growth. But we also must be building more social homes. But I seem to remember that the draft local plan that the Tory Labour coalition supported at the last full council meeting did not include one single home formerly known as a council house to be built. Even David Cameron has stated in his last election broadcast a couple of days ago. I believe it is also in their manifesto, and I recommend you read it if you suffer from insomnia. It got me off to sleep in no time, the most boringest document I've ever had the displeasure to read. And I quote, everybody should own their own home. That's nice if you can afford it. What he didn't say, and neither does their manifesto state, any mention of building more social housing. So let's take a look at unfortunately I'm going to be taking us slightly into the national picture as well. It is right that rents are kept as low as possible, but by reducing rents in this way over the next 4 years will cost not just this council but all councils across the UK £2.6 billion by the end of the decade, and lead to a further gap of £1 billion a year from 2020 to 2021 onwards. Lowering the rents for social housing tenants could force district councils to scrap their plans to build 40,000 homes over the next 30 years. The LGA states that by 2019-2020, the annual funding budget gap will represent 60% of the government's total housing maintenance budget. This policy has not been thought through properly and will have dire consequences not just for those lucky enough to be currently on our waiting list, but for our existing tenants as well, and they will see a steady decline in the standard of maintenance of their properties. It is for this reason that I cannot support the scheme or budget implications to this council and its tenants, and therefore will be abstaining.
Thank you, Councillor. I now call Councillor Kerry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Speaking as the Chairman of Audit and Risk, this issue's been going on for some time. We've got a debt of £230 million for around 11,000 tenants. And the third flagpole, anyone using cigarette box maths just not to have the fear of looking at the full depth of the scale there. that needs to be paid over 30 years, you'd be wondering whether to put a Greek flag or not on the third flag of the base centre. So this government policy of interfering, yet again another government interferes with housing revenue account and its funding, is completely wrong. People talk about devolution. Let us have the devolution so we can get our housing revenue account back on its 30-year plan of repayment, because it's the tenants who pick up the burden of this building. They're the most vulnerable people. And we're stuck with this town. And it needs to be resolved. My next point, if members cast their memories back to this time last year, when the administration was looking to put up rents to help pay for the housing revenue account and other services, Labour was completely opposed to putting up rents. And they've come here today saying, cutting the rents are terrible, they want to make their policies a bit clearer. We have to deal with our debts, and we have to deal with our mates. And we will be supporting this, because it doesn't matter if this council supports it or not. It is government policy, and we've just been given an opinion on this matter. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Can I call now Councillor Stephen Hillier, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I will start off by congratulating Councillor Brown on her maiden speech. I will take issue with her on one aspect of it, because she stood up and said she's not used to speaking in public. Okay, I'll stand for it. You don't like speaking in public. I've never noticed that stopped you in planning. The other item, I'm just very surprised to hear Councillor Smith indicate that he'd be happy to hang a Greek flag over the Basildon. I thought Greece was Europe. So,
Well, if you look at the scale,
but the point I wanted to make, Mr. Mayor, is this. The last Labour Prime Minister, I think it was possibly when he was Chancellor, brought in a policy for housing rent convergence. That pushed up the rent to the council tenants, and I think that it seems odd now that we hear Labour Party saying, but we're now going to object to rents going down. It was a policy that has possibly led to the reason why the current Chancellor is saying we can't afford it on the benefits side. But rent convergence was something we had to do. Councillor Turner mentioned the negative subsidy issues. They were poor policies. And we are in a situation now having to redress that. I will, of course, be supporting this budget. Yes, there's difficulties in the future. We're not going to get around that. There's not going to be a quick fix. There never was going to be a quick fix to this. And I'm sure that if governments left us alone to get on under one set of rules for any significant amount of time, we might actually make some progress. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I now call Councillor McGurran, please.
On the 14th of January 1978, the Windsland Theatre, San Francisco, the living legend that is John Lydon brought to end a gig prematurely and with at the end of the career of the Sex Pistols with the immortal words, "Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?" I mention it because the Conservative administration must have known exactly what he meant when, with increasing horror, they thumbed through this horrific HRA report. On every page it is a story of how this council has been shafted by their mates in national government. I'll be honest with you, I don't give a monkey's how much the Tory councillors have been let down by the subjects of the man crushes in Westminster, dashing David Cameron and gorgeous George Osborne and the rest of the Bullingdon boys. What I do care about, though, is how let down the people of Basildon have been by a HRA report which tells the sorry story of massive holes in revenue which will cripple service provision for years to come. Let's have a quick walk through the report that Councillor Headley, I think, described, because I didn't recognise it. Rent policy. The budget delivered by your mate Gideon Osborne delivered an amazing bonus to Basildon Council, a 1% reduction in rents in social housing for 4 years. How thrilled Councillor Turner must have been to see a huge chunk of his HRA disappear in smoke in an instant. So instead of rises of up to 3% to plug some of the holes in the council's finances caused by their own government, we now have to live with a reduction of 1% a year. Even the report itself says, should for any reason the bill not be enacted, the council can take a view on whether to adjust rents in the light of the government's intentions for future years. That's the sound of this administration desperately clutching at straws, hoping against hope its own government sees sense. I suspect there's not much chance of that. Basildon's cabinet should be blushing as they read this. It goes on to say the change to rents has resulted, combined with other factors such as right to buy, I'll come back to that in a minute, in a major reduction in the resources available to HRA over the next 4 years and in the 30-year financial strategy. George Osborne doesn't seem quite so gorgeous now, does he, Councillor Turner? This ill-thought-out Osborne budget, supposed vote pleaser, will mean Basildon and many other councils can effectively give up any pretence of providing decent services to residents. That's the reality of this. Going on to right to buy. How often have we heard Conservative councillors in this chamber eulogising their beloved right to buy policy? Hang on a minute. This report finally, I'm getting it right, you're not. Well, this report finally sheepishly acknowledges another result of right to buy. That this policy has been so successful that, according to the report, this has also had a major impact on resources available to HRA, and it is estimated that this will amount to 4.7 million over the next 4 years. So who is this right to buy policy that's putting yet another massive hole in the HRA actually benefiting? Surprise, surprise. 4 in 10 council houses that are bought by tenants are later flogged to private landlords who, even more surprisingly, charge far higher rents than councils. The Commons Communities and Local Government Committee has found these rents can be as much as 50% higher than the same council property just next door. The report goes on to say, selling social housing at discount only for them to become more expensive than possible. So the Commons Committee report says, selling social housing at discount only for them to become more expensive and possibly of lower quality housing in the private rented sector is a significant concern. We believe that measures to restrict homes sold through right to buy need to be explored. That sounds like a bloody good idea. Let's hope if it does happen for the sake of the people of Basildon. Going on now to pay to stay, as I suspect you lot refer to as fairer rents in social housing. Fairer my arse. Further into the HRA report, the further you get into this report, the harder it is to see. It's a ringing endorsement of Conservative government policy. Page 53 says it's not clear how such a proposal might change tenant behaviours, and one obvious conclusion is that it could lead to an increase in arrears, and it would be reasonable to assume it could lead to an increase in right to buys. So give it time, and yet more good news for predatory landlords looking to exploit working families in Basildon. Local Government Association research has established tens of thousands of hard-working families will have to leave their council homes, but will be unable to afford a local alternative. Pay to stay is expected, I'm nearly there, just bear with me, it's important. Pay to stay is expected to hit hard over 60,000 households in England, and Basildon is exactly the sort of area which would be effective. A report by Savills estate agents, well-known Corbynites that they are, found that far higher rents in the private sector and soaring house prices in much of the south will create a situation where many council tenants who earn just over £30,000 per cut-off will find themselves between a rock and hard place, unable to afford to buy and struggling to afford to rent. The council leader may want to reflect on that the next time he's bragging about housing price rises in the Echo. Even the Tory-controlled LGA has attacked the pay-to-stay policy as unfair on hard-working families and a disincentive to work. The LGA said research showed around 50% of those tenants classed as high earners.
Can you wind up?
I promise you. In the south east and east of England, would not be able to afford to pay market rents or take up right to buy, would have to move out the area. Just to be clear, these high earners in Basildon would be a couple with children to support earning £15,000 each. Together with the forced sale of council housing, the end of permanent tenancies, and the almost total discontinuation of funding of social housing after 2018, this creates a perfect storm and effectively the end of social housing as we know it. This from the council is trumpeted. It's utterly bogus. Local homes for local people's policy. The people of Basildon didn't realise.
Councillor, I insist now, you have to wind up now, please. You're over time. You've gone well over time.
Wasting time now. The people of Basildon probably didn't realise when they promised local homes, the council meant local to Doncaster or Stoke. Thank you.
I now call Councillor Stephen Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Anyone here grew up in Basildon through the 70s, 80s, 90s and up to now? Yeah. Right, I'm a Basildon.
Councillor Ward has the floor. Please listen.
I'm a Basildon boy. Lived here since 1974. I consider myself, this is my town that I've lived in. I went to school here. And I'm... That's very naughty. I'll get an extra 30 seconds for that. How's that? Right. We all remember here the big sell-off in the 80s where the so-called great, right to buy came about. I went to school. We all lived in council houses. We all went to comprehensive schools. Harping back to the early bit, my brother, really intelligent lad, should have gone to a grammar school, restricted from it. But we all lived in council houses, so did a load of my mates. Then they all got sold off, and I believe they're owned now by Duke of Westminster's son, is it? Who I believe is on the Conservative side of the table. So we've got a 20 million, was that right, debt? We've got a big sell-off of all of our houses. I've got guys that work for me that they need somewhere to live. One of them is 45 years old, living with his mum. Not because of choice, but through necessity, because there's no social housing. And with the new builds coming along, you're selling the land off to, allegedly, get rid of the debt, but you're selling them off. Where's the additional revenue coming from? That's where I've been trying to find out exactly here how we're going to plug this gap. Because impact analysis shows me, when I'm going to be guided, I'm going to read up on the rest of it. That's why I'm going to abstain from this. Because if the rents are going to go down, the housing associations are going to struggle to build more houses, which we need to do. We all know that. We just got to work out where they're going to be built. Private rents are going up. Again, I've got two of my guys that are currently renting private places. Again, they'd love to have their own place. Social housing needs to be brought about. And I seem to see in here, I can't see where the social housing is coming from. It just seems as if everything's been sold off. And I've got to agree with the Labour guys on this to a certain extent, that this just isn't good enough for Basildon.
I'm now going to call Councillor Frank Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I fully support Councillor Shepherd's observations. If we're to see the crucially needed numbers of homes built, councils must have a lead role in house building and be allowed to reinvest in the homes and infrastructure which they are best placed to help deliver. Local authorities could build 500,000 new homes and transform the lives of hundreds of thousands of families if given greater powers, resources and flexibility. The rent reduction scheme fails to acknowledge this and is clearly an attempt by the Tory government to make further cuts to local government funding via the back door. It is in effect flying in the face of the Decent Homes agenda, and no doubt as our properties deteriorate over time and we carry a higher number of void properties, these will fall foul of the impact of the forced council houses sales initiative proposed in the Housing and Planning Bill. At the briefing provided to members on this budget, the impact of the proposed sale of high-value vacant properties was earmarked as unclear. The Housing and Planning Bill received its third reading in the House of Commons on the 12th of January and is now at the committee stage in the House of Lords, with the expectation that it will become law in the spring. Some commentators have predicted that the bill will lead to the end of social housing as we know it. But is this really the case? What are the implications for housing and local government, and what are the threats and opportunities that the bill presents? The bill contains a number of significant proposals for housing and local government, including starter homes, the voluntary right to buy for housing association tenants, the sale of high-value council homes, near-market rents for social tenants on high incomes, reducing regulation of social housing, phasing out of lifetime tenancies, measures to tackle road landlords, neighbourhood planning, and planning reforms including automatic planning permission on brownfield sites and to support small builders. To my knowledge, when the government originally set out their plans to fund the new right to buy discounts for housing association tenants by selling much needed council homes, it was going to be like robbing Peter to pay Paul. But it's only now that we have the detail of the bill that we can really see how bad things are. There are still a lot of uncertainties because so many of the decisions are being left to regulation. But we have three main areas of concern. There is no commitment to replacing the homes that are sold, that the government has failed to exempt homes from being subject to sale, and that councils might be asked to hand over much more cash than they ever make from selling properties. The bill includes no commitment whatsoever to replace council homes that are sold through the scheme. The government has previously tried to placate concerns about the bill by pledging to replace every home that is sold, but with no explicit commitment in the bill to replace homes, that pledge is unsupported. The shortcomings of the existing replacement scheme for right to buy, which has replaced only one home for every 9 sold, demonstrate the need for a cast-iron commitment from Cast Iron Dave on replacement. It is therefore vital that these costs are considered by the government as part of the wider debate of council funding to avoid putting at risk the capacity of councils and housing associations to invest in this much needed housing. For instance, councils should be able to keep all the receipts from the sales of their own housing stock. Until such time as we know and understand the full implications of the bill on our finances, this administration is asking us to take a leap of faith on what appears to be a Tory government initiative to minimise social housing and or the ability of councils to plan and provide social housing for future tenants. My fear is that in doing so, the robbing Peter to pay Paul effect will no doubt push up our homeless budget beyond recognition. Notwithstanding George Osborne's comprehensive spending review announcement, which indicated a significant increase in government investment in new homes, the bulk of this investment will be going towards homes to buy, with little or nothing for those on lower incomes facing the brunt of our affordable housing shortage. This is a major flaw in the plan, but is hardly surprising. We're very concerned that starter homes for sale at 20% off the market rate manifesto. Unfortunately for me, even with the comprehensive spending review commitment to increase investment in new homes, I fear very little is being done to help resolve the need for a diverse range and mix of housing tenures. And when the full impact of the housing bill unravels, the future is looking pretty bleak for future generations. I do not support the rent policy or the sale of high-value vacant properties. I believe both of these initiatives will have an adverse effect on the provision of social housing for our residents. On this account, I cannot support the budget.
I now call Councillor Andy Raggett, please.
Hey, Mr. Mayor, we were talking about grammar and comprehensive earlier. The thing I learned at grammar school is how to mighty language when ladies are present, so maybe there is something good about grammar schools. I'd also like to congratulate Councillor Brown on her maiden speech. Just a shame the punchline at the end was all wrong. I mean, it was good up till then, I was enjoying it. We've seen on both sides of the chamber here that the chicken littles amongst us, the sky's falling in, the sky's falling in. And in fact, as Councillor Turner alluded to, no, it's not, because we have professional officers and it's about managing the issues as opposed to wailing and moaning about them. I would like to correct Councillor Shepherd. He's got on my same list as Councillor Ellis now. Because if he spent more time looking at the history of Basildon and what we've actually done, as opposed to reading bogus manifestos, he would know that the sign that we actually commissioned was actually at no cost whatsoever to the council. It came from EU funding, and without that EU funding, there wouldn't have been a sign. So there was absolutely no cost to the council whatsoever. So it's a bit disingenuous to have implied otherwise. It is about getting your facts straight. Now, not voting the HRA budget, and I've been in Councillor Headley's shoes, actually is an option anyway, because without voting for it, we're not able to set the rent for the tenants, which means that we're acting unlawfully as a council. So the idea of let's not vote for it without anything else in mind on the basis of national policy is just a bit Yahoo sucks politics, really. I mean, I am disappointed, I'll be honest, in aspects of this report. I am disappointed, and this is the difference, I think, between Conservatives and the cult of UKIP or the Corbyn diktat. We can be disappointed with our colleagues without necessarily getting censured as a result of disagreeing with our colleagues in Parliament. And I'm disappointed because I'm disappointed that we're going to have, in 2044, still a £200 million debt. I mean, that's a big debt. And it was always the ambition of this council, when we got control of the HRA account, to repay that debt. I am disappointed that the premise for us taking on that debt has been altered by the government. But I think the mature way is to be asking my colleague, the cabinet member, to be, and officers, to represent Basildon on that issue to the people that make that decision. Not Yahoo sucks, we're not going to vote for the HRA account because, you know, George Osborne did this, which is just a little bit politically naive on all sides of the fence, really. As Councillor Turner said, we have, and as Councillor Headley said, we have professional officers. We have a game plan. We work to that game plan. We look at that game plan in order to ensure, as the Conservatives always had and always have with both the HRA and the General Fund, a responsible, balanced budget that delivers services to our residents and does it even within the constraints that we face from big government, be it Labour or Conservative. The other thing I'd like to correct some of the scaremongers about is it says in the report that Decent Homes is now finished. That's good, because the big issue that housing always had was reactive repairs. The fact that we could never get ahead of the curve because we were constantly chasing the game on repairs that needed to be done. The Decent Homes programme allowed us to get into a proactive stance and start to actually forward plan those repairs. And I don't see anything different in this, and I haven't heard anything from Councillor Headley that doesn't persuade me that we're now in the position to do that, even with the cuts. And therefore, that sky falling in, the residents not getting repairs done, is just scandalous scaremongering, yet again, from certain elements. So, there are elements I'm disappointed in, but Councillor Headley and officers have done the exact right thing in preparing it for the betterment of our tenants and to enable us, no matter what's coming out of big government, to get on and do the job. And that's why I should be voting for it. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Headley, would you like to now wind up?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to thank all the councillors for their contributions. I'm glad that Councillor Baggett mentioned the Basildon sign. One of the UKIP councillors to my left referred to the two MPs in the borough. Actually, there's three. I'm not sure which one they want to leave out. We will. Some of them, all of them. I think there's only. They're all Conservative councillors in Essex, aren't they? Apart from an ex-Tory MP in. I'm trying to remember where he is. He's in Clacton. We'll cross over that. But we will be making representation. Thank you for reminding me, Councillor Baggett. As always, there will be ongoing dialogue with our representatives in Westminster. And I think it's right and proper that we do make those representations. Again, well done to Councillor Brown for her maiden speech. I found it particularly interesting as it was as predictable attacking the government. There's little point in local councillors attacking the government that they cannot influence. You don't influence people by shouting at the government in Basildon on a fairly windy, wet night on Thursday. The recommendations as printed address the legislation that is currently going through Parliament, and if you read the recommendations, we do not have entire clarity around how those bills will be passed with amendments, and I know there's been a number of challenges in the House of Lords, and that's why the recommendations are couched in the terms they are. The recommendations are, as Councillor Baggett said, to address the issue of the HRA. There were no amendments coming forward from opposition groups. They had plenty of time to amend it. As one of the councillors mentioned, 8 councillors turned up for the members' briefing, which was a pretty poor turnout considering how important this issue is for the residents. I'd like to thank Councillor Turner and colleagues for their support. It is important that we pass the budget for the HRA. This is not a job done, this is a job in progress. This is work in progress. We will be working very hard with officers to ensure that our tenants get the very best service. The housing repair scheme has just gone out. In fact, the procurement process is finished. We will have first-class repairs process for our tenants. That will be ongoing. I alluded to the fact that there are challenges in the future. This administration is well positioned to meet those challenges and ensure that the residents of this borough are adequately catered for and looked after. And I commend the recommendations of the Council.
We've got 2 members absent, so we'll wait for them to return and then I'll take the vote. Now then, can I have a show of hands? All those in favour, please show. All those against, please show. All those abstaining. Therefore, the budget is carried. We will now take a 20-minute